Hello, everybody. Welcome to Brockton Writers Series for September 8th, 2021. We'd like to begin, as always, with a land acknowledgement. We wish to acknowledge that the Brockton organizers used to and usually do our work on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Huron-Wendat nations, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. In today's world, we can do our work from everywhere, but everywhere in North America is Indigenous land. And so we strongly encourage you to look up, if you don't already know, the First Nations, Inuit, or Métis land that you currently live on and work on, and the treaties and the legacy of the Indigenous people of that area. We acknowledge the ways that colonization, genocide, and racism impact Indigenous peoples, and that settlers such as myself have a responsibility in making space at these events for Indigenous voices. We all share the responsibility to critically understand and challenge forces of oppression. And for many of us, this includes recognition of how our ancestors as settlers and ourselves as settlers and the structures that we work in have contributed to these colonial legacies with both silences and actions. It means writing to your elected officials. It means holding your governments and your workplaces accountable. And it means doing everything you can to understand the issues and to support and uplift Indigenous voices and rights. We'd also like to acknowledge that Black Lives Matter, and we will continue to feature and center Black and Indigenous voices, other people of color, and other underrepresented groups in our series. And this is included in our mandate. Thank you very much to Ephemera series for hosting us on their online platform. Today's lineup includes a guest speaker, followed by a brief Q&A, and then our 4 readers, followed by a group Q&A for them as well. Each presentation will be a little shorter than we were in person, and we will skip the break. So the whole thing is a bit more condensed if you are somebody who used to attend Eklate. Please type your questions into the YouTube chat box as they occur to you. There's a little bit of a lag, so it really helps us if you write them down sooner rather than later. We will collect them to ask during the Q&As. I'll turn it over to you, Emily.
Brockton Writers Series was founded in November of 2000. Since we've been Toronto Literary are Clark, love to hear from you. We would like to acknowledge with deep thanks the continued support of the Ontario and Albert of the Ephemera. Their events right here on this very YouTube channel.
Hi, everybody. We seem to be having a bit of a problem with Emily's connection there. So I'll just take over from there. We've been active in Toronto literary scene for over a decade. In today's world, we're very happy to be able to have people who aren't necessarily from Toronto be joining us tonight. Our volunteers are Hannah M. DeMichael, Nancy K. Clark, myself, Sonia Pather, Emily Sanford, and we have the pleasure of working together to keep the Brockton Writers Series going. If you would like to join the team, please check in with us after the readings. We would love somebody to wrangle Facebook, as well as other things. Oh, there's all kinds of things that need to be done. So check in with us. We'd love you to get involved. We'd like to acknowledge with deep thanks the continued support of the Ontario Arts Council who make this series possible. And of course, we're also indebted to our gracious host, Jen Albert of Ephemera series. Check out their events right here on this YouTube channel. Their next event is Wednesday, September 15th. That's next week. I'll be there. I hope you will too. Finally, with sincere thanks to you, our audience, for being here tonight, we will move on to our guest speaker. Tamara Faith Berger writes fiction, nonfiction, and screenplays. She's the author of Lie With Me, 2001, and The Way of the Whore, 2004, which were republished together by Coach House Books as Little Cat in 2013. Maidenhead, 2012, which also won the Believer Book Award, and Kundalini in 2016. Her fifth book, Queen Solomon, was published by Coach House Books in October 2018 and was nominated for a Trillium Book Award. Her work has been published in Apology Magazine, Canadian Art, Tattle Creek, and Canadian Notes and Queries. She has a BFA in Studio Art from Concordia University and an MFA in Creative Writing from the University of British Columbia. She lives and works in Toronto, where she co-runs the literary speaking series Smutburger. I love that name, Smutburger. Tamara?
Thanks. So it's good now to go. I'm good to go.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. I'm a little nervous. This is just feels very nerve-wracking to me. But thank you so much for asking me to do this, Brockton Writers. I'm happy to be here. And I hope that we can have, a little Q&A or discussion after my talk. So writing sex as a part of your work or as the main subject matter, there's two things that I would like to discuss craft-wise. Well, also just letting you know that I came to sex writing from a pornographic angle. I had a job for maybe 3-4 years in my early 20s. And I feel like that there's some tricks of the trade, of porn writing that does translate very well actually into literary fiction, poetry, nonfiction, just whenever you want to use or go into sex as a part of your work. So the 2 points that I'll be discussing tonight are about employing the first person point of view, the I. And I'm also going to talk just a little bit about threading in thinking to our sex scenes, which is not really porn's forte, but which I find can be liberating, for people that want to include sex in their work, no matter the genre really. So I just want to say that I like to shift away from psychology when we're thinking about writing sex as a part of our work. The question's not really why any of us want to write about sex, and I also don't find why is a very interesting question in the actual scene. It's more so, and there's quite a lot of meaning in how, right? How we choose to do it. And also what I'm going to talk about is kind of also the how to create something sort of bubbling underneath or threaded through the sex scenes. So the how can we write in an effective way about sex? And of course, the answer is going to be different for every person. But I have found that employing the I to narrate a sex scene immediately gets both you, the writer, the narrator, and the reader very close. Sometimes uncomfortably close. And I like to call this the sexually active point of view. So very generally, the sexually active point of view is about telling us something that happened, perhaps even as it is happening. It's the I did this, or I'm doing this, I saw this, I smelled this, I sucked that, I felt it, I was there, that was me. And it's essentially, in my mind, the private being made public. And I find that this is very powerful around sex. And as it relates, I actually think that sex scenes, no matter the genre, kind of volley a little bit between high art and low art sort of vibe. And you can call it erotica versus porn, or you can think of it as the meshing of a more literary or narrative urge with a body-based kind of anal, oral, genital sort of urge. And mixing the high and the low using the sexually active point of view, the I, for me, just kind of fits together. It accesses the age-old technique of the confessional, which is really a well-worn, well-trod way in literature to access sympathy, arousal, feeling. And, in a more contemporary way of thinking of this I think that the sexually active point of view gets us into a kind of radical subjectivity. And of course, with sexual subject matter, this can be political. And, that old chestnut, the personal is political in this I, radical subjectivity about erotic experience. especially erotic experience that we may not have heard about so often before. So the second craft piece that I want to talk about is thinking. How we can thread thinking into our sex scenes, which might, just depending, feel very much either locked in the body or in the mind. So I think it's important, even if you're writing romance or erotica, which are genres often of emotional resolution or happy ending, to admit or include that negative, boring, traumatic, uncomfortable, or fearful sexual experiences and or thoughts are a fact of life. And this is just one way that I have found to think about writing sex, to think about this notion of how or where your character or narrator finds themselves on the continuum of, or the reality fantasy continuum, which a simpler way of saying it is just good sex, bad sex. And just to talk a little bit about my own work, so kind of like the easiest way for me to explain what I'm saying about this kind of fantasy reality continuum. I've been really interested in my characters' experiences between sort of horror and arousal, between the worst thing happening and the best thing happening, between even being in pain and being in pleasure, between, I need a glass of water, between what they want and desire to happen to them and what is actually happening. And I have found that playing or writing on this continuum between fantasy and reality has overall really deepened my experience of writing sex. Did I drop the water? Basically, that there is always something else happening for the narrator, right? More than just what is going on in front of them. And I know that not everyone is going to want to go this route, this walking of the reality fantasy line or the pleasure pain line, or even the good sex, bad sex line. But this is sort of my how, right? How I approach sex writing. I approach it as an unstable scene, unfixed, things move, feelings change, and you might get caught. Ultimately, I think that writing and reading sex is about a willingness to enter the murkiness a bit of our desires, exploring a little bit the shadows of our desires, and just to get a feel for like a chaos sometimes and that goes on inside of us, and to stay there, to take a look around, and to enter this disjunction and contradiction. And I really think that literature is a great place to experience this. I think it's better than pornography. So I'm happy I made that switch. And to conclude, and it's very important for me to note that I do see my work coming out of a feminist writing practice. Like it literally came from porn, but it is also, a feminist practice. It's both at the same time, with a particular affinity for the tradition of literary experimentation by women that emerged, in the 70s, 80s, 90s, kind of all over the world. And I guess I'm thinking of writers like Gail Scott in Canada, Kathy Acker, Dodie Bellamy, Dubravka Ugresic, Elfriede Jelinek, and there's many. And it's also about an experimental sort of tradition. I feel like it's writing sex for me is kind of like a messing with the pipes kind of practice, one that wants to fuck up thought and language from the inside. And it's also pretty often for me about having a female eye or my eye in sacred or closed spaces. It's an urge, and again, this is just for me, to participate in traditionally male-only spaces like pornography and like religion. And sometimes the only way to enter forbidden spaces is to be stealthy, fiddle around with the pipes, and leave a mess. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Tamara. I really that it was every bit as juicy to hear you talking about that. I'm getting a pop-up that my internet connection is unstable. So if I disappear again, Dorianne, please jump in again. So I will do my best. Okay. So we do have A question from our YouTube viewers. Are there recent books you can recommend that integrate sex really well? I'm assuming sex writing, all the scenes that you've been talking about. What would you suggest for recent books?
Just very recently is Cleanness by Garth Greenwell. I think that's a really amazing book. He's a great writer. And I really, really liked Luster by Raven Leilani. Both of those books have a ton of sex in them that are done really well. And actually right now I'm reading Mona by Paula. It's right here actually. I don't know how you pronounce properly her last name, but Olokcharak, I'm not sure. But anyway, it's very funny too. I didn't mention humor in my talk, but humor is also something that can really go with sex like really well.
Humor, that's great. That's to me, that I love seeing humor. It sort of brings in the unexpected, and sometimes when you launch upon a sex scene in your book, you're kind of like, oh gosh, holding yourself, trying to see, oh, is it going to be bad, good, how is it going to go? And I love it when it's really funny. Can you think of any hilarious anecdotes, any funny sex scenes that come to mind?
Well, I mean, the main one, of course, but I read it like 35 years ago, is what's his name? Philip Roth. I mean, it's so bad now, like it might be terrible to read it, but what's his famous book? I feel like someone's...
Sorry, say the author again.
Portnoy's Complaint by Philip Roth.
Oh,
That's
okay.
really stupid, terrible, bad. Of course, reading it from now, but sex, but yeah, but it's very funny.
That's great though.
But I mean, that's not a great example. You know, I'm sure there's been many more since, you know, the 60s.
Oh, but sometimes it's nice to go back to the thing that really was your first experience with like hilarity and that kind of reading, that kind of scene. So we have another question for you. Within the story, do you find it hard when you have to write the sex scene again between the same characters, but in a different way that can continue to intrigue readers?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think it depends. I like to think of sex in a book as part of the narrative and furthering the narrative, right? So I think if you can think of if they're having sex, if the characters are having sex again, there's something else, like I was talking about, sort of going on for them, and it's either furthering their story or taking them backwards, or, yeah. So I guess that's what I can say to that, as opposed to maybe just like changing the what they're actually doing in bed, although that, or wherever they're doing it, it doesn't need to be in bed, but just that kind of, those two things might go together, the narrative tension or the narrative drive and what they're doing. But yeah, I think it's just about to think about the story and what's going on underneath for them.
Mm-hmm. Like dialogue can catapult a story sometimes, or catapult it backward too. I imagine different interactions, sex scenes, different encounters could do the same thing, and very likely does. In lives as well as in literature.
I have a question if we have a minute.
We do.
Lie With Me was made into a movie. And the movie was very sexually explicit. I wasn't sure going into it. I was like, how are they going to make a movie out of this? Mm-hmm. And so I wondered, like, what was that like? Did they come to, do movie producers come to you and say, yes, we want to do this? Or did you have to negotiate with them to have the sex as explicit as it was in the movie version?
Well, like the person who made the movie, he's my partner, right?
Oh, well, that explains that.
So I think, like, for him, that was part of the interest in him making it, like in a certain way. But weirdly enough, like at the time, I mean, also I had never really been involved in anything movie-wise before at that time. It was a long time ago. It was 2004, maybe 2003, 2004. Like, it was a long time ago, and I think like in a weird way, I kind of just gave it to him and like let him do his interpretation of it, because yeah, it's really different, you know.
Yeah.
And how can you really translate all that to a film? Like, I mean, you know, some of those scenes in Lie With Me, the book, are like insane, right? They're very porno, right? So yeah, and he wasn't trying to make a porno.
I didn't realize that was your partner, so thanks for that explanation. But I think it's really great that you can do that, letting go. You know, I've done that a bit before with like theater plays, where I'm just like, I've written this play, it's in your hands now to do in a fringe festival in another city where I'll never even see it. It's interesting to let go of your work in that way.
Yeah, I think it's good. It's exercise. Obviously, you don't want the piece to be ruined or anything like that, but it still exists. Like nothing gets destroyed in the process.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, do we have any further questions for Tamara before we move along? Any from the YouTube chat? I'm just gonna zip over and have a quick check, but I don't see any new ones in the YouTube chat. Okay, well, Tamara, thank you so much for joining us today, and thanks so much for sharing with us all of your expertise in writing sex, writing juicy scenes.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So usually at this point, we would hand around a pitcher for Pay What You Can donations to help support us and our writers, but we can't do that in a pandemic. So we do have a PayPal account. We would love it if you could go to paypal.me/Brockton Writers, and we'll put that in the chat. If you could spare a few dollars for our brilliant writers. And if you'd like to take our survey and suggest topics for future guest speakers, please take our very brief BWS survey and let us know your thoughts. We will also post that link in the chat. We would love for you to suggest topics, specific speakers, other readers that you'd like to see. We want to hear from our audience. And now for the readers. Again, please type your questions into the chat as they occur to you, as there's a bit of a delay, and we're going to gather the questions and ask them to all four readers at the end. First up, we have Antonio Michael Downing, who grew up in Southern Trinidad, Northern Ontario, Brooklyn, and Kitchener. He's a musician, writer, and activist based in Toronto. His 2010 debut novel, Molasses, from Blaurock Plet. No, I should have got a pronunciation check on that. Blaurock? You'll have to correct me on that, Antonio Michael. Was published to critical acclaim. In 2017, he was named by RBC Taylor Prize as one of Canada's top emerging authors for nonfiction. He performs and composes music as John Orpheus.
Hey, hi everyone. It's an honor to be here and to be the first reader. And thanks to Tamara for that really interesting talk. And I do know who Clement is, so I did know I did know that he directed your book. I'm going to read two pieces from my book Saga Boy, which came out on Penguin Random House and is coming out on Milkweed Editions in America in a week. So very excited for that. And but yeah, talking about growing up in a lot of places. I'm going to read two selections, one from being a kid in Trinidad and one from the first time I came to Canada, my first winter in Canada. I came to Canada in the middle of December 1986, which in Northern Ontario, and I don't mean Sudbury, I mean like Dryden, is a terrifying place. So I'll say that. But first of all, I wanted to say thank you to Brockton Writers for having me, and to all the amazing authors here. Jónína, Fonda, Tamara, and CL Polk. Big up yourself, as we say in the vernacular. And yeah, here we go. So this is from chapter 1, Monkey Town. Pulori was my everything. Pulori. These 3 delicious syllables ruled my life. I was 5, and if I ever got my hands on as little as 15 cents, I would buy Pulori, a fluffy golden deep fried ball of dough that was crunchy on the outside and chewy on the inside. I lived in New Grant, a village in the south of Trinidad, or down south, as we would say. It sat between wide, muddy rivers full of crocodiles, thick tropical wilderness, and fields upon fields of sugarcane. The yellow and brown two-story building where we learned was called New Grant Anglican School, and it had been established in the year 1900. To the front, there was a paved asphalt area where we played netball, rounders, and hopscotch in our neat uniforms. In the field next to that, we dashed about, made believe, and whenever possible, yelled as loudly as we could. Next to this field was a small shop of wonders. They sold pickled red mango, coconut sugar cakes, sticky peppery anchar, and of course, pulori. It was pretty much neutral in taste, but it was served with spicy mango, chutney, or sticky sweet tamarind sauce on brown wax paper. Pulori was my favorite thing. One day, I bought 3 or 4 and was fixated on inhaling them while waiting to cross the main road. I was straining not to get any chutney on my khaki uniform. Cars roared by while I stood, my mouth wet with wanting. I was captivated by the mesh pattern inside the dough balls, by the heat of the wax paper and the green mango chutney. Just as I looked up, a 20-seat maxi taxi passenger van dashed right by my nose. My nostrils burned with diesel. A drunk on the other side of the road staggered backwards, his eyes bulging big like guavas. "You're gonna get killed one day." In Trini, an alcoholic was a rumbo. Everybody drank rum. And I knew from the way big people talk that you never listened to a rumbo. Still, I finished my pulori, which was never puloris, even if you had several, and looked both ways before crossing to my street, Monkey Town Road, 3rd Branch, which at this point was the only place in the universe I knew. On a day like that, it would have been normal to hear the sound of Miss Exley's voice drifting over the tombstones. There was a cemetery on either side of the street, and ours was the first house after the one on the left. Her voice would catch me as soon as I left the junction, drifting like a breeze. My grandma, we called her Mama, and everyone else called her Miss Exley, was always singing. When she woke up with the Kiskadis, when she was happy and smiling, when she was thoughtful and laughing to herself, or when she went to bed, the bullfrogs as her backup, she sang. Hymns mostly, about Jesus and salvation and redemption and power. So basically every single song in the Anglican hymnal, power in the blood, how great thou art, rock of ages, abide with me. And the draggy one that was her favorite, stars in my crown, which I didn't really understand then, except I knew it had something to do with getting stars in your crown when at evening the sun goeth down in the mansions of rest. What I did know was that her bright eyes and soft face got very strange when she sang this hymn. She would smile, and her whole face, she would smile with her whole face, but have tears in her eyes. Was it possible to be happy and sad at once? In those moments, coming home from school, the world seemed dim and out of focus. Everything hushed. Her voice perfumed the very air. The tall grass across the cemetery leaned in slow motion. Beads of sweat slid down my forehead and tickled my neck. All of creation became her voice calling me home. Bum, bum, bum. And now, fast forward to 1986. One night, I fell asleep in the tropical jungle, and a few days later, I woke up in a blizzard. I was in a tiny place called Wabagoon, in the vast forests of Northern Ontario, Canada. It was the dead of winter. My world, which had always been set in a teeming rainforest, had become a dead emptiness buried in snow and ice. In a way, it was just a new kind of bush. But while Trinidad was always lush and bursting with noise and fruit and vibrant colors, this new bush was barren as the surface of the moon, a silent blanket of whiteness. Icicles hung, glistening from the eave troughs. Snowbanks were piled as high as treetops. The angry wind howled in the bluffs. I peeked out the window of our little house behind the tavern with my eyes wide and bewildered. Nothing would ever be the same. My dead grandmother haunted me. I kept replaying the details of her death as if turning them over and over would make them less confusing. I remembered her first stroke and the way it made the right side of her face droop like melting plastic. I recall strangers milling about waiting for her to either recover or pass away. At her sister Teresa's, she was in the small room upstairs with a kerosene lamp and a bed too big for the walls. Her bracelets turned black. This happens, people said, when silver is pure and mixes with the chemicals given off by the skin of the sick. When lucid, she would try her heavy tongue at groaning out words no one could understand. When it got bad, she coughed up buckets of thick yellow phlegm and groaned in deep booming notes of misery that struck me with dread and were still echoing in the corners of my head. Her room filled with the smell of death. I clung to her skirts even still and lay down in the bed beside her until someone forced me to get up. The grown folks looked at me, their brows knotted with pity. In their whispers, I heard, "She's waiting for Joan. She's holding on till Joan comes from Canada." I watched Mama die, her eyes fixed on something no one could see, and her mouth hung open as her last breath escaped. I was still clinging to her skirt. Throughout all this, I did not cry. It did not move me emotionally. Perhaps because I was paralyzed with fear, or perhaps because I didn't understand what any of it meant. I simply watched, stunned, as everything I had ever known came to an end. On that happy note, that is all.
Thank you so much, Antonio Michael. It's beautiful. I loved, she would smile with her whole face. Beautiful. Next, we have Fonda Lee. Fonda Lee is the World Fantasy Award-winning author of the Green Bone Saga, beginning with Jade City and continuing in Jade War and the forthcoming Jade Legacy, as well as the acclaimed science fiction novels Zero Boxer, EXO, and Crossfire. Fonda is a 3-time Aurora Award winner and a multiple finalist for the Nebula and Locus Awards. Fonda, welcome.
Thanks. So I struggled a little bit trying to decide what to read tonight because I'm on the verge of launching the 3rd book in an epic fantasy trilogy. So I've been spending the last 2 years closing out this huge series, and everything in that book, which comes out on November 30th, it's this brick, is spoiler. So it's just like 700 straight pages of spoiler. So what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to read from Jade City, which is the first novel in the Greenbone Saga. So if you are, which I hope, if you've read the book, you'll still enjoy it, and if you have not, you won't. Nothing will be spoiled for you. The Greenbone Saga is it's a secondary world epic fantasy that I have described as a martial arts gangster family saga that takes place in a modern era Asia-inspired metropolis. So the things that you want to know about this before I read this piece is that there is a fictional country called Kekon, and it is the only place in the world with a resource known as bioenergetic jade. And the people who live there are able to wear this jade, and it gives them greater than human powers. And the rest of the world cannot use, other people cannot use this, but it is modern times and the world is opening up, and there are certainly people from other countries and cultures who want that jade as well. This is going to be a chapter from the point of view of a character who is coming home to KCON after having been away for quite a while. Let me see, do you need to know anything else? The island is essentially ruled by two large family clans. So there's a government, but like the people who can use jade are called green bones. And the clans are really sort of the shadow, the power behind the power, if you will. And the story takes place primarily from the point of view of one of these clans and their family. Call Shaylin-san arrived in Jeonloon International Airport with the vaguely hungover, cotton-headed feeling symptomatic of all 13-hour flights. Crossing the ocean, staring out the window at the passing expanse of blue, she'd felt as if she were turning back time, leaving behind the person she'd become in a foreign land and returning to her childhood. She was confused by the combination of emotions this aroused in her, a poignant, bittersweet mixture of elation and defeat. Shay collected her baggage from the carousel. There wasn't much. 2 years in Ephemera, an unaccountably expensive university degree, and all her worldly possessions fit into a single red leather suitcase. She was too tired to smile at this pathetic irony. She picked up the receiver of a payphone and began to deposit a coin into the slot, then stopped, remembering the bargain she'd made with herself. Yes, she was returning to Jeonloon, but she would do so on her own terms. She would live as an ordinary citizen of the city, not like the granddaughter of the torch of KCON, which meant not calling her brother to send a chauffeured car to pick her up from the airport. Shay replaced the phone receiver in its cradle, caught off guard by how easy it had been to slip into old behaviors within minutes of setting foot on KCON. She sat down on a bench in the baggage claim area for a few minutes, suddenly reluctant to take the final steps through the revolving exit doors. Something told her that when they spun her around and pushed her out, the journey would be irrevocable. Finally, though, she could delay no longer. She stood up and followed the stream of other passengers out to the taxi line. When she'd left 2 years ago, Shay had never intended to move back. She'd been full of anger and optimism, determined to forge a new life and identity for herself in the great, wide, modern world beyond KCON, away from anachronistic clans and the outsized male egos of her family. Once in Ephemera, she found it harder than she'd expected to escape the stigma of being from a small island country known mostly for one thing, jade. Indeed, Shay learned that the name Jeonloon often provoked blank looks. The foreigners called it something else, Jade City. When people abroad learned she was Kekanese, their reactions were comically predictable. Initially, surprise. KCON was an exotic, make-believe place in the minds of most Ephemerians. The post-war boom in global trade was reversing its centuries of isolation, but not yet entirely. She might as well have said she was from outer space. The second response. Eager jesting. So can you fly? Can you punch through this wall? Show us something amazing. Here, break this table. She'd learned to take it with grace. At first, she tried to explain. She'd left all her jade back on KCON. She was no different from them now. Whatever advantages in strength, speed, and reflexes she possessed were accounted for by the fact that she still woke early and trained on her apartment patio every morning. Lifelong habits persisted, after all. The first 2 weeks had been almost unbearable, the feeling of being in a deprivation chamber of her own making. Everything so much less than it used to be. Less color, less sound, less feeling. A washed out dreamscape. Her body slow, heavy, achy. A nagging suspicion of having lost something vital, like looking down and noticing you were missing a limb. The nighttime panic and the sensation of being adrift, of the world not being real. It would have been bad enough, even if she wasn't surrounded by boisterous young Espenians who had the attention span of monkeys and were always talking about clothes, cars, popular music, and the vagaries of their shallow, convoluted relationships. She almost relented. She even booked a flight back to KCON after the first term, but pride overcame even the near debilitating horror of Jade withdrawal. Fortunately, the flight had been refundable. It was far too complicated to explain to her few college friends what it meant to be jaded, to come from a green-bone family, and why she'd given it up. So she just smiled innocently and waited until their curiosity waned. Gerald always teased her. You walk around acting all normal, but one day you're going to bust out doing some crazy shit, aren't you? No, she'd already done that. He was the crazy shit. The sky was that odd mixture of haze and waning light. The concrete was damp with northern sweat, the incessant drizzle and mist that pervaded the coastal plain around Jonloon during monsoon season. It was late, past dinner time. Shay stood in line and waited for a taxi. The other people in line did not pay her any attention. She was dressed in a colorful, short summer dress that was fashionable in Espenia, but felt too clingy and garish in her home country. But accepting that, she blended in, looked like any other traveler, jadeless. It was with relief and a twinge of self-pity that she realized there was little chance anyone would recognize her. The next taxi arrived. The driver put her suitcase in the trunk as Shay climbed into the back seat and rolled down the window. Where to, miss? He asked. Shay considered going to a hotel. She wanted to shower, to decompress from the long flight, to be by herself for a little while. She decided against showing such disrespect. Home, she said. She gave the driver the address. He pulled away from the curb and into the streaming jostle of cars and buses. As the taxi crossed the Way-Away Bridge and the steel and concrete skyline of the city came into view, Shay was struck by a sense of nostalgia so profound she found it difficult to breathe. The humid air through the open window, the sound of her native language being spoken on the radio, even the terrible traffic. She swallowed, close to tears. She had only the vaguest idea of what she was going to do in Jonloon now, but she was undeniably home. When they entered the Palace Hill neighborhood, the taxi driver started glancing back at her in the rearview mirror, eyes flicking up every few seconds. When the taxi arrived in front of the tall iron gates of the Call estate, Shay rolled down the window and leaned out to speak to the waiting sentry. Welcome home, Shay Jen, said the guard, surprising her with the now inaccurate suffix, as well as the sense of familiarity and attaching it to her given name. The guard was one of Hilo's fingers. Shay recognized his face but could not remember his name, so she merely nodded in greeting. The taxi drove through the gates to the roundabout in front of the main house. Shay reached for her purse to pay the driver, but he said, "There's no fee," called Jen. "I'm so sorry, I didn't recognize you at first in those foreign clothes." He turned around to smile at her with earnest hopefulness. "My father-in-law is a loyal lanternman. Lately, he's having a little business trouble. If there was a way you..." Shay pressed the money into the driver's hands. "Take your fee," she insisted. "I'm only Miss Call now. I don't have any say in the clan. Tell your father-in-law to send word up the proper channels to the weatherman." She suppressed her guilt at the man's disappointed expression, got out of the taxi and hefted her suitcase up the steps to the entrance. Kianla, the Abuke housekeeper, met her at the door. "Oh, Shay, so you look so different." She hugged Shay and held her out at arm's length. "And you smell Espenian." She laughed gaily. "But I shouldn't be surprised now that you're a big shot Espenian businesswoman." Shay smiled weakly. "Don't be silly, Kianla." Through sheer workaholic grit, she'd graduated to the top third of her class, despite the fact that she'd been studying in her second language and, having been schooled at Caldew Academy, found the Espenian classroom environment utterly bewildering. So much sitting around in large rooms and talking, as if every student wanted to be the instructor. In the spring, she'd interviewed with some of the big companies that recruited on campus. She'd even received an offer for an entry position at one of them. But she'd seen how the interviewers looked at her. When she walked into the room, the men around the table, they were always men, assumed she was Tuni or Shotarian, and the first glimmer of prejudice would come into their eyes. When they looked at her resume and saw she was from KCON, that she'd been raised to be a greenbone, their expressions would cloud with outright skepticism. The Espenians might be proud of their military might, but they had little regard for her martial education. What use would it be in a civilized, professional place like an Espenian corporation? This wasn't KCON, where the name Call was golden. The right word from her grandfather wouldn't get her anything. In those moments, her romantic notions of making it on her own felt foolish and lonely. Now, here she was, back in the house she hadn't been able to leave fast enough a couple of years ago. Lon was standing at the bottom of the staircase. He smiled. Welcome home. Shay went to him and embraced him tightly. She hadn't seen her older brother in 2 years and was overwhelmed by the rush of affection she felt for him. Lon was 9 years older than she. They had never been playmates, but he had always been kind to her. He defended her from Hilo, had not judged her when she'd left, and had been the only member of the family to write to her when she was studying in Ephemera. Sometimes his letters, in their precise, even handwriting, had felt like the only link she had to Kekon, the only evidence that she had a family and a past. Granda's not doing so well. He'd ended simply at the end of his last letter. The decline is more in his spirits than his health. I know he misses you. It would be good of you to come back to see him, and Ma as well, after you graduate. With the sting of splitting from Gerald still as fresh as an oozing burn, she'd reread her brother's letter, turned down the single job offer, and booked a flight back to John Loon. Lon hugged her back and kissed the center of her forehead. Shay said, "How's Granda?" At the same time he said, "Your hair." They both laughed, and Shay suddenly felt as if she'd let out a breath she'd been holding for 2 years. Lon said, "He's waiting for you. Do you want to go up?" Shay took a deep breath and nodded. "I don't suppose it'll get any easier if I wait." They climbed the stairs together, his hand on her shoulder, so close to him she could feel the tugging hum of his jade, a barely perceptible texture in the air that her body responded to with a yearning squeeze of the stomach as she leaned in closer to him. It had been such a long time since she'd been affected by jade that she felt lightheaded. She forced herself to straighten away from Lon and face the double doors before her. "He's gotten worse lately," Lon said. "Today's a good day, though." Shay knocked. Carl Sen's voice came back with surprising vigor through the door. "I could perceive you, even without your jade, coming through the door and dwaddling your way up here. Come in, then."
Thank you so much, Fonda. I can't wait for the final book to come out. Shay is a fantastic, fantastic character. So many other fantastic characters in there as well. And sometimes it makes you cry. Next up, we have Jónína Curtain, a Red River Métis Icelandic poet who was 61 when she received the 2016 Vancouver Mayor's Arts Award for an emerging artist in the literary arts category. Her second collection of poetry, An Honest Woman, was a finalist in the 2018 Dorothy Livesey Poetry Prize. Jónína?
Thank you so much. Oh, well, this will be a change because I'm a poet. So mind you, I do write more narrative poetry. So it's not like some poetry can be. I am interested very much in story. So I'm coming to you from the land of the Coast Salish nations, Kikwa Nation, Stolo, Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, Kwantlen. Many of them used this area, which we think of as New West today. And they all use the river. So there's probably some nations that we're still figuring out we need to name. It's an ongoing process. So I want to thank Brockton for having me. And Tamara, good for you. I'm going to read your book. It's something I've thought about myself writing. I wouldn't put my picture on the book though, because people wouldn't buy it. They go, what would she know? 66, right? So gray-haired. So I also, and Antonio, my gosh, alchemy. There's alchemy in your words. I could feel it. Good medicine. Thank you. And Fonda, I love that type of writing. And I have to confess that I don't do a lot of reading of it, but I certainly watch a lot of shows that would probably be made from that type of writing. I tend to read more poetry. So I'm a late blooming poet. I started writing at 50, and this is one of my very first poems that I wrote that I liked. So I wrote a lot of stuff I didn't like. And it is about my life as a young woman, being mixed blood, growing up in Winnipeg, I lost two brothers in their teens, and there was a lot of violence in my home. So I had a lot of things to deal with. So I decided to toddle off to the disco and drink and dance and forget about all of that stuff for a number of years. So this is a little bit about that time in my life. Can everyone hear me okay? Good. It's called Collective History. Divergent lives meet at the border. Bogarts on the edge where the North End meets downtown. Winnipeg's Studio 54, an old bank building where life's deserters cross over, meet on the dance floor. Tuxedo boys, rich, looking to drown out the voices of obligation, crave the drugs that the arsonist and the boxer provided. Portage in Maine, an intersection where need meets want, and amid the inner rubble, the marble pillars, we all play a transactional game where everyone tries to trade up. In his tower, the DJ, a demigod of nightly worship, takes us into trance dance. Encoded in our bodies, a collective history of days when we hung mirrors on trees, when pain and pleasure reflected visceral truth. We are all crows, like shiny things. The mirror ball, shining light, offers flickering fractures, but never invites reflection. Heavy with memory, my body finds wordless ways to stir cellular recall. My turtle mind, slow, steady, walks me to the dance floor, where my snake body dances me. I am in a moving sea of sound within the beginning of time, an elemental dreaming born of water. Inside, the oracle divines my salvation, but I am still suspicious of my body's story, leave a trail of marooned memories, frozen fragments. Parts of me are scattered on the altar of one-night stands. Once home, haunted by my losses, I weep. Water meets wood as I lay on the hardwood floor, contemplate the collective curse in our genes. A shame carrier, I am doomed to wander. I am a vortex of empty space where my bitterness and brooding calls out to the hag. Our dark truths pass between us like a smoldering joint. Shared suffering, never articulated, leaves a residue, causes an itch that cannot be scratched. I am a curious contradiction, like the sun and its shadow, trying to forget my own fragility, suspended between two worlds. I exist between night and day, where salt becomes wisdom, and at the end of my bed, a pack of black dogs. On my lips, a thickening scar, tastes of toxic soup. A fog, and within it, a spell cast over the victims. We carried our shame to the dance floor, the crimes of our ancestors, a collective illness. Their original sin follows us to after-hours clubs, this time rich boys and bikers. Occasionally an allergic reaction. Earthbound alchemists, we all learned that the rise of smoke cannot be hastened, that sometimes passions are their own punishment. Whew. So that was me going to the disco to drown out my sorrows and then coming home and laying on the floor and crying. My next door neighbor told me, "Did you know you come home and cry?" No, I didn't know. And I was kind of embarrassed, let me tell you. I was like 23 years old. So from that, I also had the confusion of my ancestry. So my family said that we were French. And I used to think, have you looked in the mirror lately? Because you're not fooling anybody. They were clearly Indigenous, especially my father. And so it caused a lot of confusion. And so I wasn't told the stories of my ancestors. So this piece speaks to a little bit of that. It's called Untethered. Is it my blood that makes me wander? The diaspora of my soul scattered over many lands. The bones of my ancestors, how they pull on me, offering so many directions. Yet how can I answer the many folded within my body? This body not my own, a shared place of suffering. It searches for safety, looks for a cord tying me to you and you and you. And yet we will all soon leave this room, leave each other. It is then that I will feel how alone I am in the territory of the Salish, with the bones of my ancestors scattered over many lands. Some just north of here, Fort St. James, the place where many lay. Others can be found at Turtle Mountain, the prairies, La'ans de Meadows, and Iceland. As I trace their steps, I feel them beside me, whispering, "Look here." Comes another voice, "No, here." Their stories forgotten, they ask me to sing home their bones, to find them in the stories of our people. They ask me to tether myself to them and to the stories. They ask me to tether myself to them and to the stories. A chain unbroken, we are stronger. The stories of those that came before the link. Untethered, we are lost. But if we are patient in our searching, we may find a way out of this place of loss, out of the wandering that comes when one does not know the stories of their ancestors. And I read that knowing for some people it's never an option to find where they've come from. And I can imagine that must be a deep burden to carry. I was fortunate because I was Métis, and the Métis are fairly well documented, it turns out, especially if your family worked for the HBC and the Northwest Company, which mine did. So I was able to uncover a lot of stories. And I was pretty excited at first until I discovered how many of them were involved in colonizing. I was expecting something different. So one of my ancestors was the one that brought Simon Fraser here. And I live near the Fraser River, which I find very interesting. He was a Métis voyageur, spoke about 7 languages, and he was his interpreter and guide. And so there's sort of this mixed feeling of pride and not pride around my ancestry. One thing that I do feel pride about is how strong my ancestors were, and I carry their love of rivers. So this I wrote after reading a lot about our history, and it's called Born of Water, which is a line that's in the one of the other poems as well. Born of water, meant to float. I sink until I rise to the big sky songs of my people, traveling rivers, strong arms paddling, 1 stroke per second. My ancestors' canoes carried them north, where a daughter is born. The mixing of blood continued until I, born of water, give thanks, hold my hands up to the big sky. Rolling back west, I kneel before the mountains, sit by an ocean of words, my place uncertain, until I, born of water, hear the songs of the Métis voyageurs, paddling 1 stroke per second. They did that for 12 hours at a time, which is incredible. I'll just read one more poem, and this one is a little bit, I'm trying to write more about healing after writing many years about other things. So this is a little bit about some of the healing. It's called Tumbling. There are rocks in my pocket, 1 for each death. The first rocks my ancestors, whispering thin, easily airborne, skipping over waters of the past. These brought comfort, became touchstones. But then came the drowning. My brother, 16, now a river rock made smooth by loss, sits next to the others. 4 years later, a bullet. My brother, 18, his rock marked by mushrooming metal, leaving a hole in him, in me. Before long, another rock, this one larger as it was mother. Aunties, uncles, grandmothers, grandfathers followed. For so long, I carried the dead. Afraid to let them go, I brought them everywhere. Others could not see the rocks in my pockets. They could not hear the tumbling, did not feel the heat of the rubbing against one another. Every rock heavier than the last, harder to carry. Yet together we all walked, losses rubbing up against one another, pressing on my thighs until open seams stretched, emptying my pockets. I have been carrying the dead my whole life. I had to let them go. That was finally when I was able to do that was after 35 years of healing. It took to get to that place where I could let them go and not feel an obligation. I'm sure you've all heard of survivor's guilt. It's a real thing. And in the Indigenous communities, we have an enormous number of losses. all of us, for different reasons. But anyway, thank you so much for hearing my words, and I'm looking forward to hearing Chelsea. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jónína. That was beautiful. I love the image of losses rubbing against one another. That is very moving. Yeah. Next, we have C.L. Polk. C.L. Polk wrote the Kingston Cycle, including WFA winning Witchmark. The Midnight Bargain was a Canada Reads, Nebula, Locus, Ignite, and WFA finalist. Mix Polk lives in the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina, the Iyakse, Nakota Nations, and the Métis Nation, Region 3. Welcome, Chelsea. And you're still on mute, Chelsea, if you want to unmute your mic.
All right, am I unmuted now?
You are.
Hooray. Okay. Let's see. I didn't actually prepare any kind of an introduction or preamble or anything like that. I'm just gonna read from the Midnight Bargain. I think the selection that I picked was too short, however, so I'm just trying to find something a little bit longer. I usually plan for about 5 minutes, and that's not enough. Yeah, I'm really sorry. I didn't realize that I was going to get to read for quite that long. Okay, I'm going to start from chapter 3. And yeah, I'm just going to read it. Beatrice awoke with the echoing pressure of a headache, and Clara laying out a dress choice for a day cooped up indoors waiting for callers. A printed cotton stripe trimmed in 30-point lace, the skirt a soft conical increase to be worn without a fulling cage. Clara halted with the gown in her arms and smiled. "Good morning, Beatrice. Are you ready for your caller?" It was time to wake up. It was time to smile and be unfailingly polite and find out why Isabella Levon now wanted her acquaintance when she clearly had not wanted it at the bookstore. "Good morning, Clara. The stripe will do." "Not the peach with the lady slipper embroidery?" "My caller is to be Isabella Levon, not Ianthe. She insisted on seeing me first." There could be a dozen reasons for that. Clara laid the gown on the foot of the bed and moved to Beatrice's bedside, dabbing a cloth in a basin of water. She wiped Beatrice's face. "You're frowning." "Headache." "You drank too much elderflower punch." Clara swiped down her neck. "I'll have cook mix you a potion. I'll bring it to you in your bath. Up you come, out of bed." Clara guided Beatrice to the bathing chamber and unbuttoned her nightgown, leaving Beatrice to descend into the water herself and place a cool cloth over her eyes. She had these few moments to herself before she was expected at breakfast, and then she would be pinned and laced into a gown that displayed her like a jewel and sent an artful message that she, expecting a quiet afternoon at home, had dressed herself simply. But the cut of the gown, from neckline to hem, was meant to flatter her youth. She was meant to be interrupted at a creative pursuit designed to reveal her education and skill. She was expected to display a sense of beauty and the skill to produce it. She played viola, though few women performed for public entertainment. She could draw in colored pastel and paint in oil, though few women's work hung on display in the galleries of Chasland. She was proficient in knitting, hooked lace, and simple embroidery, all skills that would be displayed on her children's clothing. Beatrice's head pounded, and she flipped the washcloth over, trying to sink into its soothing, cool embrace. Mercifully, the door opened, and Clara hustled inside. Beatrice lifted the cloth from her eyes and accepted the dose bottle, tipping it to her lips. Cook had tried to sweeten it, which only made it worse. Skyborn gods, that's awful, Beatrice gasped. Thank you, Clara. Is there water? I'll get it. Harriet, having just come in, crossed to the jug and poured a cup. Oh, I'm going to die, just die, Harriet whispered. Ian de Levan is coming to call on you. He is beyond a Valser and Marquis. He's beyond even a minister. Beatrice is just like crossing Quill Street, where young Laura Cooper catches the attention of the Margrave of Went, and... Oh, no. Harriet didn't know the truth. Harriet, it's not what you imagine. But he helps her father catch a hen, Harriet insisted. Oh, what? We do not keep hens. Neither did they, Harriet countered. It was from the market. Beatrice didn't want to begin untangling her little sister's logic. As you say. Harriet, Mother called. Come here, please. Harriet huffed, but she left Beatrice alone. Once clean, Beatrice donned a dressing gown and went downstairs to breakfast. A copy of the morning's broadsheet sat next to Father's empty place, and Beatrice picked one up, turning the pages to the shipping and finances section. Harriet leaned over to swat at her hands. You'll get ink smudged on your fingers. Ink comes off. Beatrice leaned away from her sister and read. Robichaud Automations is putting on display of the latest inventions from Visny. These automatic wonders will delight onworkers as they usher in a new age of productivity and convenience. Here in Pendleton? Mother asked. In Meryton. I should like to see them. I understand that they can spin fine thread at astonishing speeds. It would be worth investing in manufactories for cotton if one acted quickly. Beatrice, Father said. He walked into the breakfast room and plucked the paper from her hands. What did I say about ladies reading the paper at breakfast? That it leads to squinting and wrinkles. But, Father, have you considered what I said about timber and iron yesterday? Father gave Beatrice a look of patient disappointment. You shouldn't be troubling yourself with such thoughts. You should be bursting with news of the assembly dance last night, of all the gentlemen you met. How many did you meet? Father moved to the head of the table, and servers moved into action, bringing heated plates of breakfast dishes to the family. We left before midnight, Father, Harriet said. Beatrice hardly had a chance to meet anyone. Father folded the paper so he could peer over it. I thought the assembly dance was important. It is, Harriet exclaimed, but Beatrice got her own cake, and she didn't dance once. Beatrice, Father said, I do wish you would take your duties seriously. Look at Harriet. She needed to be at that ball to make friends her own age. Leaving early cost her opportunities. I'm sorry, Father. She wasn't feeling well, Harriet said, defending her sister at last. But for all that, she has a suitor, and he's going to call on her today. He's not. Which suitor? Father asked. Ian de Levan. Father's smiling, indulgent gaze flicked from Harriet to land on Beatrice. Smile melted into open astonishment. You spoke to Ian de Levan? What did you speak of? Fidelity, Beatrice said. Honoring's one family. The stars? Romantic, Mother said. Intellectual, Harriet said, and wrinkled her nose. Beatrice dropped her gaze to her plate. We only talked, she lied. No one needed to know the rest. Besides, Chaslander's girls took kisses too seriously. It hadn't meant anything. Not from him. I hope you weren't too free with your knowledge, I said. A man expects to guide his wife in all things. Displaying too much cleverness can make a woman seem less appealing. Mother is clever. Mother smiled, picking up her teacup once more. Your father is correct, my dear. We understand the shrewdness of women, Father said. Your education is unusual compared to a woman of higher birth. I stand by my decision to teach you the keeping of accounts and records, even though your husband is likely to have a secretary. It's more than you need to manage a house, but you'll know it if your suppliers are cheating you. That is where a wife's cleverness shines. She could do rather more than that. She hated the idea of pretending to be less than what she was for the sake of her husband's comfort and the 100 little ways she was expected to bend and give way. Yante had listened to her opinion. He had thanked her for it. He was the kindest man she'd ever met. But was it enough? He's coming here, Harriet exclaimed. Today. He's not, Beatrice said, but father set down his paper and his cup. What are you doing, dawdling down here? You must get ready. But he's not coming here today. Father laughed. It's noble that you're not getting your hopes up, but you need to get ready for his calls. Upstairs with you. Be sure that Clara covers every detail. But I know he isn't. Go. Dismissed, Beatrice rose from the table. Okay, I'm going to stop there.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. I am also a huge fan of your books as well. And if there isn't any questions from the audience, I'm going to try not to just, try and get you and Fonda to talk about the things I think your books have in common. So let's see if we have any questions from the audience. I don't see any right now. Okay, so let's just start with my question that I have for both of you, and then we'll find things to ask Yanina and Antonio and Michael as well, which is that the Greenbone Saga is a trilogy, and the Kingston Cycle is a trilogy. And did you set out to write trilogies? Was that always the idea? And if so, is that intimidating, or is that like just what you thought you could do? Or did you think maybe it would be a longer series and then it turned out to be a trilogy? Like, what is the process of being like, I'm writing a trilogy. This is a trilogy. This is 3 books.
I guess I'll go ahead and answer that. So when I wrote Jade City, it was on spec, so it wasn't guaranteed to sell. So when I wrote it, knowing that it could be a larger story, but I had to write it so that it was also it stood alone and was satisfying as a single volume. But I certainly knew the world could contain a large, and that was my hope, was that it would be a series. So then it went on submission. It sold, actually, Chelsea and I have the same editor. So it sold to Sarah Guan, who was at Orbit at the time. And when it sold, they asked me for 3 books. So at that point I knew that it was, and I think I had a short period of time to like send them a brief synopsis of what the second and third book would be, which, of course, changed quite a bit in the process of actually writing the second and third books. But yes, when you know that it is going to be a trilogy, you can think very big picture about the overall story, but also have to bear in mind that each book has to be its own satisfying narrative. So I personally find it to be a pet peeve when the second book feels like it's just a bridge between the first and second books, or it ends on a cliffhanger and it's not its own thing. So after I wrote Jade City, I became obsessed with like making sure that second book, I think it's the make it or break it book, that second book. It either kind of elevates it or it ends up kind of like the soggy middle. So yes, I had in my mind the scaffold of how the story would build across the 3 books, with the first book being a conflict between the 2 clans, and then the second book being that conflict but taken to an international scope, and the third book takes it to an intergenerational scope. So that was the way that I structured the trilogy, so that it felt it told an overall arc, but then each individual book also had its own arc.
For me, for the Kingston Cycle, I wrote the first book, and it was just me and my computer. There wasn't anybody else involved. And I queried for an agent with Witchmark. And when I was writing it, the advice was not to write a book that absolutely depended on being a series for your first book. So I didn't. I was like, I'm going to take this advice. I'm going to be a good writer. I'm going to write a story that is just a story, and that's it. And I sent it around, and when the editor who wanted to buy it said, I love this story. Is there a sequel? I was completely unprepared. I didn't know what to do. So in my mind, I'm freaking out while my mouth is saying, well, I have a couple of ideas and a direction I could take the book. Totally lying. I didn't know what to do. And so I had to do some scrambling around and some real thinking to figure out where I went from the original book. And what I decided was that part of the reason why I thought that Witchmark was a standalone was because the main character, Miles Singer's story completed. Like he did what his character arc needed him to do. He did it. And so I couldn't actually see writing another book with him as a protagonist. So I changed my scope. I went looking around. I decided that what I wanted to do was I wanted to write about a character who also kind of needed to have a novel's worth of experience to like teach them to stop being a nitwit. And so I picked Miles's sister, Grace, who was a minor antagonist in Miles's book, who did a heel face turn as soon as she realized that what she was doing was wrong. And that second book was extremely difficult. The thing about the first book that you're writing is that nobody is watching you while you're doing it. So you can just, you can do whatever you want. You don't have anyone to disappoint. So just go ahead and do it. But when I was writing the second book, I really, really was anxious about letting people down with my second book. It was a big deal. And in the end, I just had to like hold my nose and jump into the pool. Because if they left it up to me, I would still be revising Storm Song today.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for that. And we do have lots of questions coming in from the audience right now. So for everyone, what was the best advice or worst advice you've ever received on your writing journey so far? So best advice or worst advice. Worst advice might be funny. Jónína, do you have one?
Oh, I do. I have a few. Worst advice. Well, I don't want to criticize anyone's critiquing of my writing or editing, but as an prairie Indigenous, my vernacular upsets people sometimes. So that was a very interesting thing. And I remember when my first book was being edited, phoning my writing mentor, Betsy Warland, and saying, oh my God, I don't know what to do. Like, this seems like they're correcting all my grammar and I don't see how that's poetic anymore. I was just really, really confused. And she just knew right away. She said, send me the comments and the stuff, send me 10 pages or so. She goes, they're trying to correct your prairie Indigenous vernacular. And no, it's a big no. And I thought that was great. So it's one of the reasons I'm on the Indigenous Editors Association board, because we need more Indigenous editors. And because we are speaking about things too that may be unfamiliar, and that can happen anytime. But there's the passive voice, is apparently scary, but it is also perhaps the way we speak. So what can I say? And I know we don't speak the way we write, but sometimes we do.
Antonio, do you have any?
Hey, I was trying to think. I think the best advice is to, I don't know, there's a lot. It's hard to rank all of the advice, but I love Walter Mosley about finishing, about stopping writing. He goes, I write a book and I see a problem, I fix it. I see another problem, I fix it. See another problem, I fix it. And one day I see a problem, I have no idea how to fix it. And that's when I know the book's done. So I always like that as advice that wasn't specifically given to me, but it was my favorite advice on it. The worst advice I got was that was a lot of people, I'm writing a memoir and it's like, and first of all, there's a bunch of bad advice around that because for a lot of reasons. But a lot of people, it's like, well, gosh, that's a whole universe of advice. I think the biggest thing was that people were like, someone was like, don't let your editors and your publishers change your story. And like there was this inherent advice to sort of distrust the editorial folks, which was just dumb because they're generally there to help you get to what you're trying to do and give you outside perspective and help guide you in places, not necessarily like, so mostly that was from people who weren't writers, but they were like, well, I want to write a book, but I just don't want to trust anyone with my story. And I just feel like that's not very practical when you really get down to actually writing a book. It doesn't matter if it's your story or not. You get to points where you can't see the forest from the trees. And in moments like that, I was really happy I had Diane Turbide to call and ask for advice. It was very useful. So that's the worst advice. The best advice, I think, in regards to memoirs, Kinesia Lubrin, who talked to me about, my sister. And Kinesia I met through, I was doing just music and I was throwing music events, but poetry nights at music events. And I just saw her online and I thought, oh, she's from St. Lucia. Yo, my sister. Okay, come through. And she was amazing. And she told me, she's like, look, just advice around just especially in a time we're going through like Black misery and talking about a story. Look, anyone that writes their life honestly will have some hurt and pain and trauma in it and some family drama in it. You're either lying or not very self-aware if there isn't any. But I feel like when as a Black man writing that, I think we always get, the story always becomes, here's a whole bunch of misery and Black misery. And Kinesia taught me, which I was very thankful for, how to gracefully accept the commentary, but shift the narrative towards, my story is about creativity and resilience and the explosion of life that I responded, that came out of me because of the circumstances I was in. And that's what I see when I see it, but that doesn't get celebrated. And I think the other thing, which is really important that she was talking about, is like, people of color, we're writers, we're experts in craft, but but we are frequently being asked to speak for all Black people everywhere, and frequently being asked to be experts in racial justice and all of these things. And I'm like, look, I have a particular experience that's mine, and I think a lot of what we're struggling for is just the freedom to just be defined by what we do and how we do it, like, as opposed to, oh, you had bad things happen to you, so let's plug you into this story that's ready-made. And that was Kinesia's group of it. We had a whole like heart to heart before the publicity campaign started, and she gave me a lot of beautiful advice about how to navigate that. So yeah, that's a long answer, but there you go.
Chelsea, best advice, worst advice?
The thing about writing advice is when I think about the worst advice I ever got, it's actually really good advice for somebody else. It's just terrible for me. And that is, don't edit as you go. If you know that you've made a mistake in your previous story, make a note of it and continue on as if you'd fixed it. I can't do it. If I know that something is wrong back there, I have to go back and fetch it. Like, I can't leave it. I cannot. And so that leads me to the best advice that I have ever gotten. Don't let anybody tell you what your process should be if you have already proven to yourself that your way of doing it works.
That's fantastic. Fonda?
Yeah, I think like on the worst advice front, it's hard to like, I think Chelsea hit it on the head when she said like good advice for some people, maybe bad advice for you and vice versa, because everyone is kind of just telling you like what works for them when they give advice. I would say in one of the things that I heard quite a bit when I was breaking into speculative fiction was to start off with short stories. And that you had to like write short stories before you could write novels, which is absolutely not the case. I jumped straight into writing novels, and I actually I came back to learn how to write short stories because they're very different. They're different art forms. They're almost like a different sort of medium, if you will. And then on the really good advice side, I once heard it said that to succeed in this creative field, you need two of three things, or your career is like a three-legged stool, and the legs are made of hard work, talent, and luck. And you can be hardworking and talented, or you can be talented and lucky, or you can be hardworking and lucky. But like, you've got to, in order, you can control two of those things, but you can't do anything about the luck. But if you put all you can into the things that you can control, it's kind of like making yourself open to luck. And there's so much in this business that is kind of fortuitous, like the right editor at the right time, or your book hitting at a time that like people are looking for that particular thing, or not, or your book launching during a pandemic. Like, anything could happen, and you have to sort of learn to weather those storms and sort of be able to accept both the good luck that comes your way and also persevere through some just really unpredictable things in publishing.
That's also really great advice, and some good advice that's turned out to be useful, right? Because even Jónína's bad advice ended up with her becoming an editor, which is a good outcome. So I love all of that. We do have another question from our audience, which is, you're also awesome. So there's a compliment as writers and readers. When and why did you decide you wanted to write? Who'll take it up first? Jónína, how about you? Because your bio starts with how you're like an older starter, right?
Absolutely. Well, I don't want to tell you the long story, so I'll try to make it short. When I was about 31, so 35 years ago, I had my astrology chart read by my dearest friend, who was an amazing astrologer. And she said, you're going to be a writer later in life and you're going to be successful. And I was thinking, in what world? Like, how? Like, I'm grinding it out here as a bank employee, airline employee, like this. I just don't even see how that could be possible. And I've kind of forgot about it. And then at 50, I had to quit work because I had chronic health issues, and I'm not one to sit around. So when the pamphlet arrived for the writer's studio at SFU, I thought, heck, I'm just going to apply. It'd be kind of fun. And I had to write 20 pages because I had already shredded all my journals. Any writing I'd ever done was just in my journals, and I'd shredded them as a purge, a cleansing, a clearing. And they accepted me. But it was a lot of that little voice, because when I picked up the pamphlet, that little voice, when I said, I think I want to apply, my second thought was, no way. And then the little voice said, you're going to be accepted. Do it. So I did it. I was rejected. And then 2 days later, they called me and said, we've changed our mind. So what can I say? The little voice is great guidance. It's really helpful with writing when you're stuck on something. I really appreciate it. So yeah, and I didn't want to be a poet. I was going to write my memoir, which I just finished. So I wrote 2 books of poetry, and now they're still calling it poetry, but it's prose and poetry.
Fantastic. I'm looking forward to that. Chelsea, when did you decide you wanted to write?
Oh, when did I decide I wanted to write? I don't really know. I don't know. I remember when I was a kid in elementary school, we got an assignment to write a story, and I think it was connected to something that we had read or something, but we were supposed to write a story. And I wrote a story about me and my friends at the PNE, which is like a yearly thing where this amusement park in Vancouver used to open up for a couple of weeks, and there would be like rides and stuff like that. And we went to the PNE, and there were no adults. I don't know how that happened, but there were none. And we were in a fun house, and my friends thought it would be a funny joke to run off and leave me to go through the fun house by myself. And so I went into the hall of mirrors, and there was something in the mirror. But was there something in the mirror, or was it me? I don't know. And it was this whole psychological kind of thing, is it like a supernatural monster, or like, is she just imagining things? Until finally I realized that I was trapped and that I would have to defeat the monster. And so I started breaking mirrors, and I fought the monster. And if this is sounding a heck of a lot like the last scene of Enter the Dragon, there is a reason for that. And my teacher thought that it was really good. She didn't talk about the underlying psychological issues or anything like that. She just said that I was good at writing. And I took that away, and I would do it for fun. I didn't really take it as a serious thing that I could actually do until much later in life. But I don't know exactly if I ever decided that I was going to be a writer. I just wrote things because it was fun. And sometimes I sent them out into the world just to see what would happen to them if I did.
That's wonderful, but it's also like a really funny story that I'm happy that I heard. Antonio, when and why did you know you wanted to write?
First of all, I love Chelsea's mouthpiece pop down. Bam. Engaged. Yeah, I don't know. I think growing up as a child, mostly it was like not having my parents around and living in Trinidad, which is a very, we just tell stories to everyone. Everything's oral. I don't remember watching a lot of TV as a child. I don't remember like we were poor. We were like, it's the third world. So we didn't really have much of anything in way of entertainment. So we would entertain each other. We would tell ghost stories. We would tell Nancy stories. We would just tell stories about what happened. Like you won't believe what just happened down the road, and everyone would just gather to hear the stories. And so I grew up sort of watching that, and not having my parents around made me really want the attention, where I was like, oh wow, you can get attention if you tell stories. And so I was, and I was fascinated by it. And then, my grandma was old at the time and would always read the Bible, and her King James Bible, and her eyes were bad. So she kind of taught me how to read when I was really young so that I could be her eyes. And so the combination of watching how the power of telling stories and how it got all that attention, and then just reading all of those crazy Old Testament stories, which are like, whether you believe or not, they're very entertaining at times. And my mind was just blown. And so for me, I was just always, that's who I always was. And I would write stories as young as, I think I wrote my first short stories when I was like 9 or 10 or something. And yeah, I never really questioned about being a writer. And I took English literature, and it was just, I never really ever questioned about being a writer, because I was like, that's just that thing that I like doing and that I always do. And for me, the oral tradition of telling stories was one and the same with writing them down. So I was walking around telling stories, and to me, I was writing, right? I was creating. And so to me, there wasn't a moment where I said, hey, I'm a writer. It was more like I just was always me. And that always involved telling stories.
Okay, and finally, Fonda?
I wanted to be a writer when I was quite young, probably like 8 or 10 years old, and wrote my first novel on the school bus. I had a long bus ride. It was like 45 minutes each way. So I just started writing on this pad of newspaper, and ended up writing like 350 pages of like this dragon on a magical quest story. And then in high school, I wrote another novel with a friend of mine, and I wrote it in biology class. I just cast everyone in my high school class in like different characters in this like pulp comic book noir novel, and then like printed it out and gave it to people for graduation. So I wanted to be a writer, but didn't think that it was like a real job. And I think I remember at one point my parents were like, yeah, that's nice, but like, think about like jobs that will be like have a stable income. So anyway, so I went to college and had a whole like 10-year plus career in business, graduated with a degree in finance, was management consultant, worked as a corporate strategist in Fortune 500 companies. And at some point realized I had just fallen off the writing bandwagon because I'd gotten super busy. I had a full-time day job. I had 2 small kids. I had no time for anything other than that. And then I realized that I just really missed it. I used to do that. I remember I had this whole like career visioning process because I was moving between one position at my company, and they were asking me, well, what's like, where do you see yourself in 5 years? Where do you see, like, do you want to be VP of this or VP of that? And I was like, I don't really want to be any of those things. I did this whole, I got this whole, career guidebook kind of exercise thing going. And some of the guiding questions were things like, well, what do you remember enjoying doing when you were a child? And like, where do you feel most fulfilled? And all these things. And that's when I remembered, like, gosh, I used to really love writing. I don't do that anymore. So I just decided to take that passion seriously. And I kind of realized, well, I'm not getting any younger. So I've got to, if I still want to pursue this pipe dream of being published, I've got to start. So I made some changes and basically was like, let's like take this easier day job and like go part-time and try to find ways to carve out time in my life to write. And I started taking writing classes, and then and then sending manuscripts out on query, and then I got an agent and the book. So one thing led to another, and haven't looked back. I thought I would like miss my corporate. I mean, I miss the income of the corporate day job, but everything else, no, everything else is like, I've no regrets about making that career transition.
Thank you all for sharing with us, and thank you in the audience for giving us your questions. It's been such an amazing evening. Please come back for our next event, November 10th, 2021. We start off the new Brockton season. That's our cycle, with JL Richardson, Kelly Robson, Mary Lou Dickinson, and Lisa Richter. We will be back here still online on Ephemera's YouTube. Thank you so much to Ephemera. Thank you to Brockton writers, readers, listeners, and supporters. We will see you then. And next week on Wednesday, remember, there is an Ephemera, and I may see you then as well. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Everyone.